Hello and welcome to another episode of the IBMS podcast. I'm Rob Dabrowski, the editor of the Biomedical Science magazine, and in this instalment I'm joined by Dr Jonathan Tyrrell, who's a lecturer in biomedical science, microbiology and infectious diseases at Swansea University. The discussion covers a range of areas from antimicrobial resistance through to pop-up public engagement initiatives in empty shops. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today, where I'm joined by Dr. John Tyrrell. John, thanks for coming along today.
Thanks for having me.
To get things going, John, I'm just going to ask you to do a quick kind of a whistle-stop tour of your career, kind of how you got into biomedical science in the first place, right the way through to where you're at the moment, if that's okay.
Yeah, I studied microbiology as a Bachelor's of Science degree in Cardiff University. I chose microbiology as my area of focus, primarily because of my interest in evolution. Always been interested in natural history and evolution, and in learning about microbiology in the first year of university, I realised that microbes were the perfect organisms to study evolution. You're seeing it almost in real time or overnight. So that was where my interest in microbiology first started. During my undergraduate degree, I took a training year in my third year, and I did that in Public Health Wales in the medical microbiology laboratories in a specialist lab called SACU, the Specialist Antimicrobial Chemotherapy Unit, and that is where my interest and my passion for clinical microbiology and particularly antimicrobial resistance really developed. And that is what made me realise I wanted to pursue that further as a career. And from there, I took up a PhD in the Cardiff University School of Medicine, studying antimicrobial resistance and the impact that has on the virulence and pathogenicity of key, particularly gram-negative pathogens. So completed my PhD and I stayed on in Cardiff University as a postdoctoral researcher. I was running, as part of that role, a research team that worked in research projects involved with preclinical evaluation of novel antimicrobial drugs and some preclinical diagnostic tools also. During my postdoc, I also got given the opportunity to start getting involved in higher education. So I started off delivering some case-based learning sessions to medical students in the medical school. And that built up my confidence enough to be able to start delivering some lectures in a neighbouring university down the road from Cardiff Metropolitan University. And I held an associate lecturer role there for quite a few years. And that's where my passion for the educational side of clinical microbiology and biomedical sciences really sort of grew. From there, I jumped into a teaching lectureship position in Bristol University. I was there for a few years, and I'm now in Swansea University, again in a teaching-focused academic role, teaching on the Masters of Biomedical Sciences.
It sounds like a straightforward, kind of quite natural, clear path. Did you always want to be a biomedical scientist in the first place, John?
Well, no. If I'm perfectly honest, I went to university not knowing what I wanted to do. It was a particular microbiology module in my undergraduate that really sparked the interest in microbiology specifically. But as I mentioned, when I was working in Public Health Wales in a clinical laboratory, doing my professional training year, that is where my real interest in biomedical sciences and particularly medical microbiology really started to be nurtured.
And what was the kind of springboard for that? Can you remember the particular thing that got you into microbiology?
Yeah, my interest in evolution is what interested me in natural sciences. And during the medical microbiology module that we sat in my undergrad, I really began to realise that actually I don't need to go out in some muddy field in the cold and the wind digging up bones that are 100 million years old. I can work in microbiology and actually observe evolution occurring overnight in the laboratory. It was a way of looking and working in evolution, but in real time.
Nice. So you kind of, as opposed to people who work in looking at evolution over, hundreds and thousands of years, you can actually kind of get a microscope on something and watch evolution kind of in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. You set up, if I use an example, you set up an antimicrobial susceptibility testing plate on a Monday. You come in on a Tuesday. If resistance is there, you've essentially observed evolution occurring overnight.
Nice. What a good way of thinking about it. And what about your interest in the teaching? Talk us through that a bit, John. And also, I suppose, when you started off on this journey, have you always been kind of academically inclined? And was it something where you were always thinking you'd ultimately go towards the teaching side of things, or is that something that came a bit later on?
Initially, starting my PhD and when I first started my academic role as a postdoctoral researcher, I didn't envisage myself going into education. But what I wanted to do is, I realized that being able to communicate the areas in which I carried out my research was very, very important, whether it be to peers, non-professionals in conference settings. And so I jumped at every opportunity to try and develop up quite a varied skill set in communication. And that's what sort of got me first involved in taking up some teaching opportunities. And in taking up the teaching opportunities, that's where I really started getting inspired by the interest that I could then in turn engender in the students I was teaching. So I think I sort of fell into the interest of education through trying to upskill myself as a researcher.
Was that a daunting thing going into teaching at first? Did you naturally fall into it? I imagine, I don't think I'd be a natural teacher. I think I would bore people, and then I would think, oh God, I'm being boring. And then I'd try and be entertaining, and then I would lose all the academic element. How did it work out for you, John?
Well, you've told me not to swear, so I won't say how nervous I actually was going into my first couple of
Yeah.
sessions. But yeah, no, it was incredibly nerve-wracking because I'd only previously delivered sort of poster presentations or more traditional presentations to small groups within the School of Medicine. And obviously teaching to year 2 and 3 medical students is a very, very different experience. What I did was thought back to my undergraduate degree and the sort of teaching approach of lecturers that inspired me and lecturers that I really engaged with their way of teaching. So, in particular, one lecturer, Dr. Day, who taught me during my undergrad, possibly the most laid back guy you'd ever hope to meet, both in conversation and the way he taught. And delivering his teaching in that way actually put everyone else at ease and sort of drew us in to being far more engaged with the material. So artificially at first, and probably not very successfully, I tried to replicate that level of sort of laid back approach.
Yeah.
But as my confidence grew and I realized actually I'm not too bad at this, the confidence grew and I naturally became more laid back in the way I deliver. And, throughout my academic career, students seem to engage with that way of delivering higher education.
Do you still get a bit nervous before you go and deliver a lecture today? I always think back of the analogy of rock stars where they're always kind of, after 20 years, they're still, every time before I play live, I'm sick. I'm not suggesting you're sick before you do a lecture, but is it something where you still feel a little bit nervous going up to deliver?
Um, yes, maybe nervous at the start of every academic year when you've got your new cohort of students, but as the academic year progresses and you build up relationships with your students, those more traditional nerves goes. But there's always a sort of some butterflies, some fighting fit butterflies, should we say, before lectures. I think that's a good thing because I think that keeps you on your toes. If you go in there completely laid back, I don't think that's a particularly good mindset to go into. So a bit of butterflies, but don't think that's a bad thing.
Yes, it is thing. To jump back to microbiology and your kind of your PhD, which was all about multi-drug resistant phenotypes. Can you talk us a bit about how you kind of fell upon that subject and how you explored it as well?
Yeah, so the idea came from my PI, Professor Tim Walsh, who's now in Oxford University. My first year of my PhD was quite linear and based around studying the epidemiology of antimicrobial resistance. And then as my first year progressed and we started discussing what direction my PhD would go into, Professor Walsh came up with this idea of looking at, well, actually, traditionally we would look at antimicrobial resistance or microbes carrying antimicrobial resistance as being the ultimate pathogen. But is that truly the case? Does having antimicrobial resistance actually make you a better pathogen or not? And so what we really did was look at antimicrobial resistance and what effect it has on the more broader physiological abilities of the cell in terms of growth dynamics, in terms of the ability to cause infection. And so we took naturally occurring resistance organisms and looked at comparing those to non-resistance phenotypes as well to sort of try and build up a picture and profile of resistance versus non-resistance.
And what did you find?
What we found was that actually organisms that acquire multi-drug resistance phenotypes and acquire the genetic constructs or plasmids that carry these masses of multi-drug resistance determinants. They're worse pathogens in our in vitro and in vivo models. So they're much worse at growing in even enriched environments. They're worse at causing infection or slower at causing infection in infection models. And that sort of plays out both what the wider research field was showing, but also when you actually look at the epidemiological data of clinical burden and mortality rates of resistant to non-resistant infections.
Yeah. Nice. How long ago are we talking here, John? When did you do this?
Oh, God. Now you're testing my memory.
Yeah.
My PhD was between 2009 and 2013. So
Right.
longer than I care to remember.
Yeah. So, I mean, now kind of AMR, a very hot topic. Was it as prominent back kind of 12, 13 years ago? Or have you seen the prominence of it increase?
Yeah, I'm quite lucky that I came into my academic career when we had finally, sort of in the last 5 or 10 years at that point, realised the real threat of antimicrobial resistance to public health. In no small part because our understanding and our detection of transmissible resistance determinants had really increased in that last 5, 10, 15 years. So I think if I was 20 years earlier, I don't perhaps think there would have been as much of a focus on the types of resistance pathogens that I was working with.
To dwell on AMR briefly, I mean, how are we looking at the moment? Are we doing well enough? Are you seeing a load of problems in the very near future? What's the short-term forecast for the moment, John, do you think?
It all depends on where you look for your information. There are very encouraging things that have happened in the last 5, 10 years. The funding into this area of discovering novel diagnostics, novel antimicrobials has shot through the roof, partly because of quite novel funding strategies that are bringing in academic partners with industrial and biotechnology partners, so all working together towards the greater good. Obviously, our understanding of the clinical impact of antimicrobial resistance is improving, and the epidemiology of antimicrobial resistance, how it spreads and how it's transmitted, is improving. And if we improve our understanding of those, we improve our ability to design evidence-based control procedures and control strategies against it. However, despite all that, it is, I believe, still probably the biggest threat that faces global public health, because all of those very positive things that I've mentioned, that's not a global approach. You can put in places strategies to control infection or carry out better antimicrobial stewardship, both in clinical and agricultural settings, as an example, in Europe. But if other larger parts of the globe are not doing that, AMR is a global problem, and so we've got very big holes in our net, so to speak, that AMR will continue to slip through.
Yeah. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but I remember listening to a podcast just before kind of when COVID was breaking and it was in Italy, and I was thinking, oh God, I'm incredibly glad it's not over here. That sounds awful. But without thinking, if something isn't tackled everywhere, it will completely spread everywhere.
No, absolutely.
After your PhD, you went and did a postdoc. For those who don't know, what exactly does a postdoc involve, John?
It's a research post where if you're lucky enough, like I was, to have your PI keep you on board, you can continue the research work that you did in your PhD. Or perhaps if you move to another university or another research group, you perhaps diversify your research portfolio. But I stayed on as a research associate to continue the research theme that I had carried out in my PhD, but apply it in a slightly different context. So, as I mentioned, in the realm of preclinical antimicrobial evaluation.
And it sounds like from the last couple of minutes of discussing AMI, it sounds like you're still very much up to date with kind of everything that's going on. Is it hard to balance that role where if you're a lecturer, university lecturer, it's sometimes easy to get kind of caught up in the day-to-day work you're doing of delivering all the modules? Is it hard to keep up with the kind of the latest research and know what's going on, or is that an intrinsic part of your job?
I think it's an intrinsic part of the job. You have to keep up to date with the research because you want to be delivering contemporary, informed material to your students, not material that you learned when you were in university 10, 15 years ago. So, it's vitally important. And, as part of my teaching, I deliver laboratory research projects. And so I have to be aware of what the current research environment is. And I still carry out research, as I mentioned, in the lab, but also outside of the lab through my Superbugs project, which is what we won the award for. And so, you know, perhaps I'm looking at different areas of the research literature than I previously did, but I'm as a whole, it's still very important to keep up to date with where the literature is.
Is that important to you as an individual as well as a lecturer? Is it something that you're kind of always driven to know what's going on in the field? Or is it something where you need to know this stuff so you can kind of do the best for your students? Or both?
But both. It would be a lot harder if I didn't have a real interest in antimicrobial resistance. I still have to teach about antimicrobial resistance and the susceptibility testing that helps us detect it to my students. But it just helps that I have organically that level of interest from my previous study and my previous roles.
You mentioned just a minute ago superbugs, and I can see the listener won't be able to see this, and I don't think you'll be able to see this online anywhere, but just over John's right shoulder is the trophy from the IBMS Awards, where he was the winner of the Public Engagement Initiative. John, first up, tell us what Superbugs is.
What is Superbugs? So we are a research-focused public engagement initiative. And what that means is, as an initiative, we carry out public engagement projects, very diverse in design, at scale and scope, but with always the primary aim of providing increased or improved knowledge in the public or school children in the areas of microbiology, antimicrobial resistance, and infection biology. But the research-focused element sort of alludes to what our larger and sort of hidden aim is, which is actually what we're really interested in is trying to understand what the most impactful way of educating various stakeholder groups is on AMR, infection control, etc. Because if we understand how best to get a positive impact in our stakeholders, that affects how we teach and how we train future biomedical scientists or future microbiology researchers. It impacts positively the public and how they perhaps carry out personal stewardship. It improves the ways in which we can develop new infection control strategies or help policymakers design sort of wider interventions. So it is a multifaceted impact if we can truly understand how we can best educate on those topics.
And how are you communicating with people through this? Is this in focus groups? Is there an online platform? Is it going out to schools and kind of doing outreach? How does that level work?
It sort of depends on what project we're currently working on. And as I mentioned, our projects are sort of very wide in both scale and scope and the nature of them. So at the top of the scale would be the very large public pop-up shops that we deliver. We've delivered one just last summer where we take over an empty retail unit in the centre of St David's, which is the largest shopping centre in Wales, one of the largest in the UK. And we turn it into an interactive microbiology experience where members of the public are able to just wander in and engage with different microbiology exhibits, displays, talk to real scientists, and learn organically about various elements of clinical microbiology. And so that's sort of the top of the scale in terms of size. Last year we had just under 5,000 visitors over a 3-week period. And the first shop that I ran back in 2019, we had over 6,000 visitors over a 2-week period. So they're very, very large in terms of scale. But then on the other end, we deliver small workshops in schools to classes of 30 pupils to sort of populate research projects that are delivered by some of our students.
Which is your kind of natural home? Is it the smaller sessions, or is it these kind of taking over shops and doing a big kind of interactive, immersive experience for people?
I think our natural home is the larger scale projects, primarily because in the area of sort of public engagement and pedagogical research, there is limited funding in doing things on that scale. There was a lot of data showing how to impactfully go and deliver a workshop into a class, for instance. There isn't much evidence that tells you how to impactfully run a large public event that actually engenders a positive change in knowledge on the public. So the fact that we've been able to deliver multiple projects on that scale means compared to a lot of people, we're very, very experienced at that, and we're good at it. I would want to say, but without sounding too egotistical. But yeah, I think the larger, more novel delivery strategies is where our strengths lie.
If you've set up in, did you say St David was the shopping centre?
St David's shopping centre, yeah.
Yeah. If you set up there, you're in a kind of an empty shop. Is it people coming along who have heard about this online, who have seen a flyer? Are they just mainly people who are just strolling through the shopping centre and they're drawn in because they see what's going on?
Well, that's a great question. And if you had asked us this 5-6 years ago, we wouldn't have known. And if you look at other pop-up shop events, again, we wouldn't have had a very good idea about what the profile of the public that were attending were. Because if you look at more traditional engagement events, things that are delivered in schools or museums, libraries, university buildings, the vast majority of people that attend those types of events are people that are already engaged and interested in science. So everything we do at Superbugs starts with a research question, a research hypothesis, if you will. And the first pop-up shop and our second pop-up shop started with that exact question. If we take a science event directly to the public, could we engage people that aren't necessarily interested in that topic? And what we found is about 65 to 70% of people that attend our events are people that had no prior knowledge to the event. So they're just people out shopping in the shopping centre, going to the Lego shop or going to John Lewis or wherever they're going in St David's, and they just see our shop and wander in and have a look around. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything in isolation, because it's not just about getting people in the shop. It's about whether the different educational strategies that we've used and the diverse and multifaceted evaluation strategies that we've tried to use, it's whether they impart a positive change in knowledge on those participants.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way of measuring that? Is that possible?
Well, yes. And again, that's part of what our research is to try and employ evaluation strategies that perhaps already exist and develop new evaluation strategies, because you've sort of touched upon one of the weaknesses in public engagement research is that we don't have a standardized approach to how we evaluate a change in behavior or a change in knowledge, for instance. So, yeah, everything we do at Superbugs is underpinned by a very detailed, stringent, and multifaceted evaluation strategy. Now, some of those are quite simplistic. So if I use an example, when a participant comes into a large pop-up shop, they're asked 3 very basic questions around infection and antimicrobial stewardship. And we ask them to indicate what their correct answers are. Once they leave, they have to leave through the exit, and we ask them to answer the same 3 questions on the way out. And very simply, what we can then do is across the lifespan of the shop, we can compare the percentage of correct answers coming into the shop compared to those that exit the shop. And so that is a very, very simple way of comparing pre and post knowledge.
Presumably, when you're seeking funding for projects like this, you need to be able to evidence some kind of impact. This is the impact we've had. So if you just we set up a shop, loads of people came, hey, we had a lovely time, I imagine you're not going to get much more funding. But is this something that you would also use, as well as to evaluate your own work, to kind of seek future funding and future support for the project?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that when I first started Superbugs, that was the approach that we wanted to take, that's helped the lifespan of the project. The initial funding for the very first pop-up shop was from a funding stream run in Cardiff University called the Proof of Concept, the ISSF Proof of Concept grant. So essentially, they were asking people to come up with incredibly novel, insane ideas and see if it worked. And that's where I came up with the idea of the pop-up shop. I think if we didn't have the shop underpinned by that detailed evaluation, and which allowed us to publish a research paper on the event, I don't think Superbugs would have then been able to acquire and be as successful in acquiring further funding that has kept us going for the next 5-6 years.
So it's a lot more complex than going into schools and delivering a talk with some slides and saying, here are some things you should know about. I mean, are there lots of hurdles? Do you have to deal with local authorities and stuff like that? I assume you do to get into shopping centres and, is there a lot of admin and kind of stuff you've got to get through to be able to sort this out, basically?
With public events, because we hold it in privatized public spaces, we don't necessarily, for instance, with the pop-up shops, we don't necessarily have to deal with the council or anyone. It would be dealing with the company that runs the shop itself. So yes, there's an element of having to set up insurance and liability and risk assessments and whatnot, because we're running a science event that has live displays and with heavy equipment and whatnot. In the schools, it's not often as difficult as you would expect. Often schools have permission built in, sort of informed consent through parents to have visitors in. For some of our activities, we would need to acquire additional informed consent from parents. Not all the time, but sometimes. One of the things that we've found challenging as a team, myself and the co-lead of the project, Professor Matthias Eberl, is around the ethics. In some instances, we don't necessarily need ethics. In others, we do. And often there's not that much consistency between the events that we do and don't. So the acquisition or the need of ethics is often a source of slight frustration.
Yeah. What are the big draws if you're setting up a public event? For my kids, I've got kids who are kind of 7 and 10, and whenever they see anyone in VR goggles, then they're like, I'm going that way. So is there a particular experiment or a particular style of engaging that works well? And does that change across different demographics as well?
Yeah, so part of the evaluation that we employ in Superbugs tries to answer that exact question. We try and determine what are the more engaging or attractive activities and events, but also what are the more informative. And those two aren't always complementary to each other. So in the last pop-up shop that we ran in the summer of 2025, we did have a VR station where members of the public could come into the shop and take part in a VR experience where they're working in a space laboratory. And whilst that ranked among the highest in terms of attractive and engaging activities, when we then measured from public responses how informative and how much they learned from that experience, it was actually ranked the lowest. So, you have to have a balance of those really attractive activities that will draw public in, and then whilst they're having fun, you sort of covertly hit them with the slightly more informative stuff.
Secretly teach and inform them about things while they're having fun.
Exactly, yeah.
Nice. And I think one of the things that was mentioned in the write-up that we saw about Superbugs was gamification of learning. I mean, going on from the VR thing, is that a trend that you see kind of getting bigger, or is it something that doesn't actually have as much value as other forms of kind of imparting information?
Yeah, well, sort of gamified learning is quite an umbrella term that we often use, but it active learning or learning through challenging and problem solving is an established pedagogical approach that I employ regularly in my teaching, and it's one of the things that have sort of informed each other. My public engagement work and education work sort of inform and help each other evolve. And yeah, it is one of the primary strategies that we use in our activities. So we have always in our public events, we have a fairground area where we've adapted traditional fairground activities to educating about AMR, for instance. So if you think about in fairs where you're throwing a ball to try and knock down some tins, okay, we all love that game. I'm rubbish at it because I can't throw very well, but we all love that game. So what we do in Superbugs is get children to play that game and compete against each other, but this time they're not throwing balls at tins, they're throwing antibiotics at infections. And so the tins that are very easy to knock down, we tell them that, well, these are susceptible. These are able to be killed by the antibiotics. And then we have another set of tins that they don't know this, but we've glued them down or something that they can't knock over, and they are resistant infections where the antibiotics aren't working. So even something as simple as that, if I sat the children down and told them that information, they'd probably get very bored and not take that information in. But because it's sort of involved within the game that they're playing, they absorb that information far more easily.
I think they do that at my local coconut shy, where there's a thing on the Peckham Rye where I live, and whenever I hit the coconut, it never comes off, John. Never ever. I think
I've no doubt these use the exact same approach. Yeah.
yeah. One other bit of information I've got about superbugs here, which I think sounds fascinating and I know nothing about, is an international collaboration to combat AMR between schools in the UK and Tanzania. How did that come about, John, and what's that all about?
Yeah, so this is one of our really exciting projects that is currently ongoing. I can't take too much credit for it. It was born out of the hard work and the inspired idea of my co-lead of Superbugs, Professor Eberl. We were trying to come up with ideas of what our next large project would be. And we had recently finished a project where we had co-produced a multilingual educational website, which sort of took everything that we deliver in person and made it a digital version online. Shameless plug here. You can see that at superbugs.online. That really opened us up to the idea of globalizing what we do, because we were getting global traffic onto the website, and we were going multilingual with European and Gaelic languages as well. So in exploring that idea and trying to engage with international groups that do educational work into antimicrobial resistance, my colleague, Professor Eberl, got in touch with a group called RBA Initiative that are working out of Tanzania and doing some excellent work in educating rural communities in Tanzania on AMR and antimicrobial stewardship. And so we just entered into a very loose collaboration initially, just chatting back and forth and sharing ideas about what we do in the UK and what they do over in the Tanzania. And then the idea was born of actually, could not just we learn from each other, but our stakeholders, our pupils in Welsh or UK and Tanzanian schools, could they actually learn from each other? So what we did was we applied for some funding, which we very gratefully were successful in getting, and so set up this collaboration where actually we as middlemen set up the structure, but then take a step back, and schools in Wales and across the UK partner with schools in Tanzania, and they share their own life experiences, not just about, again, I keep on reusing the terms sort of medical microbiology and AMR and infection control, but learning about their day-to-day lives and each other's societies as well. So there's a wider benefit beyond just our core topics. And the project's been absolutely fantastic. Part of the shop that we ran last summer had an art exhibition full of, I think it was just under 50 pieces of art that were produced by pupils from this project, artwork from Tanzania and schools across Wales.
Oh, amazing. That sounds like a brilliant project. So if we look at it from a broad perspective, why does public engagement actually matter, John? Why is it an important thing for us to do, to be aware about, and for us to practice?
So if we think about it in broad terms, all science really is done for the betterment of the human condition, to use very grandiose terms. And as scientists carrying out that research, we have a responsibility to communicate that in an effective way to the public that eventually are going to be benefiting from that work. Firstly, that builds trust. If we can effectively communicate what we are doing to the public, that brings down the veil of mystery or mystique that sometimes wrongly surrounds scientific research. And if the public understand what we're doing, there's going to be that wider trust. Now, talking about it from a medical microbiology and a biomedical sciences background, you earlier mentioned COVID. That's a perfect example of where, for the betterment of society, in terms of rolling out testing, vaccination, we relied on public trust to trust what we're saying and engage with what we wanted them to engage with. So, if I think about medical microbiology and personal antimicrobial stewardship, you can bang the drum to the public about you've got to take your full course of antibiotics, or you're running the risk of resistance spreading and resistance emerging. We can bang that drum to the public all we want. However, if they don't understand the basics of what's a bacteria, what's an infection, what's an antibiotic and how does it work? If they don't understand those basics, they're not going to understand more complex issues like antimicrobial resistance. And if they don't grasp the complexity of that, they're not going to grasp the threat that it's carried by it. So I think in my area, at least, an informed public means that we're able to impart those positive interventions on society.
And you're obviously very successful in public engagement. You've done some incredible work. If there's some youngsters at the start of their career who are listening to this and they think, it sounds like an incredible thing to do, but it's a big jump from starting out in a lab to running a whole kind of concept pop-up in an abandoned shop. What should people do to start off with, John? How should they get into this kind of area?
I would firstly say don't be limited by your own confidence. I think you've got to have the confidence to sort of, whether it's an opportunity to volunteer at an event that someone else is running, take it. I have so many students in our cohort on the Masters of Biomedical Sciences in which I teach that helped out for 1 hour in a school event that we ran. And from that, I've wanted to get involved in designing their own events. So just taking the opportunity to volunteer and get an idea of what public engagement can be is the first thing. If there is that seed of interest that starts to grow, I can only say the single greatest piece of advice is surround yourself by good people and surround yourself by inspiring people. Because yes, Superbugs has been very successful so far and we want to grow that, but Superbugs wouldn't exist if it wasn't for people like, and I'm going to name drop a few people here, people like Carl Smith and Sarah Hatch in Cardiff University, and James Matthews is another one, who really inspired me to get into public engagement in the first place. Professor Ebel, who I've mentioned, who's my co-lead, that has been a fantastic colleague and a crutch of support throughout the lifespan of Superbugs. But then also all of the work we do is built on an army of volunteers and people who enthusiastically get involved with this sort of work. Success is built upon the people that you build relationships with. So I think those two bits of advice would be what I would give to people.
Perfect. And one last thing which we can nicely segue into after those words about surrounding yourself by brilliant people is, of course, I mentioned before, you're the winner of last year's Public Engagement Initiative Award at the IBMS Awards, which are now open for applications. How was your experience of entering that award, John? And you were against some incredibly tough competition in your category. That was a real kind of hotly contested one. How did you find the whole process? And were you surprised to win, or did you go in thinking, I've probably got this sewn up?
No, anyone that knows me knows that I would have gone there completely pessimistic, just going there for the experience. I think the whole process of applying or submitting to awards and applying for grants and all that sort of thing, even if you don't get shortlisted, it's a positive experience, because when you're working in academia, in science, you never get much of an opportunity just to sit there and reflect and think about what you've previously done. It's always about, right, I finished that. What's the output of this? What's the next thing? What's the next project? You're always trying to move forward. And so when you sit down and submit your work to these sorts of awards, it actually provides you with an opportunity to sit down and reflect on what you've previously done. And there's multiple benefits to that, right? There's the fact that often we're too hard on ourselves, and you can actually sit back and go, you know what, actually, we've actually achieved quite a lot, and we've achieved some really good stuff. I always see it as an opportunity to see gaps of where we can then move forward, because often applications such as the IBMS award submission form asks you some quite challenging questions, and it means that you have to confront, yes, what are the positive things of the work that you've done, but also where are the potential limitations. And very often our next bit of work will be thinking, actually, okay, so we don't do that particular aspect very well, or we don't actually understand how to do that very well, so let's design a project to try and address that limitation.
Brilliant. Fantastic answer. And I think we've probably come to the end of our time there, John. But thank you so much for the time today. A massively well-deserved winner of that award. Everything you've talked us through today is quite inspiring, and I wasn't involved in the awards myself and probably didn't quite realise the scale of it. So some incredibly good work, and thank you for coming along today to talk about that and your wider work in AMR and everything you do. So yeah, thank you so much, John.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much to John for taking part in this episode, and thank you for listening too. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and remember that this episode can be used as reflective learning for your CPD. Please do keep an eye on IBMS social media feeds and the website for future episodes, and thanks again for listening.